Hello, I'm Michelle McCory, and we are at the New Orleans Investment Conference, now in its 49th year. Now, investors have been coming to this conference since 1974 to stay ahead of the game, to learn about opportunities, but also to be aware of potential risks and threats to the economy and to their finances. Well, my next guest is here to help us tackle two of those threats: a potential banking crisis and a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. And this comes as Wells Fargo is warning that a CBDC is right around the corner. Well, here to help us understand the significance of this, what it means, and what you can do about it is George Gammon. George is an investor, entrepreneur, and macroeconomics expert. So good to have you back with us, George. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
We give you all the hard topics, George, to help us simplify them. So let's start off with the CBDC, central bank digital currency. Just as a recap for our viewers, that is fiat that is issued by a central bank on some kind of open ledger, potentially a blockchain, so that obliterates anonymity and privacy. Every transaction can be monitored, and it's also programmable, so the government can decide when your currency works or doesn't work according to preset dimensions. So give us a broad overview of what a CBDC is before we get into the specifics here.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, it's a dollar. And that's kind of what most people get wrong. They think that if we have a central bank digital currency, then that means that Jerome Powell is going to come out tomorrow with a press release saying, well, oh, by the way, we were using this dollar, but now we've got this thing called Fed coin that you can use. That's a CBDC that you can use that in lieu of the dollar, and it's going to somehow compete. That's incorrect. So the way you've got to think of it as CBDC is just simply a dollar.
Digital dollar.
Or all dollars now almost are digital. It's just a dollar that, instead of being a liability of Wells Fargo or the commercial banking system, is now a liability of the Federal Reserve, the central bank. Or that you're unifying these ledgers towards basically one ledger system. That's really the foundation for a central bank digital currency. And that's what allows the central bank to do all the things that we're worried about. All the big brother stuff, all the Orwellian things, the social credit score, and probably most importantly, it gives the central planners the ability to issue credit, not based on merit, but based on narrative. So you really got to pay attention to not what they're calling the CBDC, because it's going to be called a dollar. But are my dollars a liability of the commercial banking system? Are my dollars a liability of the Fed? Or has the Fed, or the BIS as an example, unified all these ledgers to where basically they're one ledger that's under the control of the central planners and the authoritarians?
Right, and the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks, if you will. So again, expand on why this would be so problematic. I want to really highlight why people say CBDC, dystopian future, Orwellian consequences. Break that down for us.
Well, most people, I think, understand that they would be able to track all of your transactions. So they get the big brother stuff. You know, your privacy would pretty much be gone, any privacy that we do have left. But one thing that people miss is what we were saying right there at the tail end, is the ability to extend credit based on narrative instead of merit. And I was saying the ability, or maybe the willingness, and why that is because the Fed has an infinite balance sheet. They theoretically they can go bust. They're already insolvent as we speak. We can get into that if you want. But really, they're gonna, as long as they have faith and confidence of society at large, they really can't go bust. So right now, the banking system issues credit based on merit. Why? Because they want to be paid back.
Merit is in who's more likely to pay that back.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. That's why we use something like a credit score, or you look at a business and say, okay, what are the cash flows of the business? What are the cash flows of this rental property, et cetera? Yeah. But if you don't have to worry about being paid back, well, then you don't have to worry about that credit score. If you don't have to worry about that merit stuff, then you can start extending credit based on political narrative. So the example I always use is, okay, well, in the future, because I'm a white, straight male, let's say, my interest rate is going to be 10 percentage points higher than like Dylan Mulvaney.
Right, to make up for your white privilege, yes.
Well, not only to have white privilege, but he's male. Trans, and now
I'm saying yours will be higher to make up for the current narrative, which is white, straight male privilege. Yeah.
And what's interesting about Dylan Mulvaney is I don't know how that would work, because he had male privilege up until about a year ago, but now he doesn't anymore. I don't know.
Point taken. That in the interest of diversity, equity, and inclusion, whichever minority or deemed to be minority group the narrative seeks to bolster would get more credit, would get an easier way, because it doesn't matter if they default or not.
That's right.
Because it goes back to the Fed.
That's right. And the real problem with that from an economic standpoint is we should incentivize lending or new creation of currency units through productivity. So as an example, if you go back to the 1800s, the late 1800s especially, we had something called free banking. So we didn't have a Federal Reserve, we didn't have the government intruding. Now, you could argue there's a little intrusion there, but we had the most free banking system that we've seen, at least in the United States, okay? So if you look at how much credit was being extended just strictly for productive means, it's almost 100%, right? So you would go to the bank if you had an idea for your business, if you had a way that you could create more widgets, if you could create more stuff, and if the bank believed you that you could pay them back with interest if this is a good idea, they would go ahead and lend on that. So that increases currency units, but at the same time, it increases goods and services. So you're making the economy better, you're increasing the standard of living, and because you're increasing the amount of stuff so rapidly relative to the expansion of M2, you actually have deflation. You have consumer price deflation. So that means the poor and middle class are getting richer and richer and richer. But now you have the exact opposite. Because of the government intrusion, because the government is such a high percentage as far as their spending relative to GDP, you have all of these currency units that are being created, ironically, about the same amount that we saw in the late 1800s, but it's going to less productive activities. And therefore, you have consumer price inflation go up, which makes the poor middle class a lot poorer, as the opposite effect. So in the future, you can imagine what would happen if they start taking away that productivity element. The goods and services, it doesn't matter anymore. It can be consumption, it can be people that don't know how to create widgets for whatever reason. So now you have this to the extreme, where instead of going to productive means to create more goods and services, that the benefit is really absorbed by the poor middle class. You have all this credit being created that's going to be for really anti-production, right? You're going to produce less goods and services. And then what that's going to do, inevitably, is make the poor and middle class a lot worse off. It's going to lower the overall standard of living. If we want to improve the standard of living, we've got to get the government and the central bank out of the equation and let the banks go back to being custodians of their own balance sheet, for heaven's sakes, and paying attention to who they lend to and why they lend. Why are they creating those currency units? But unfortunately, the CBDC, like you said, is doing the complete opposite of that.
And that's just part of the problem.
Yeah.
Because a CBDC would also be programmable, as I mentioned, so they can decide when your currency works or doesn't work for certain transactions or with certain premiums. Now, we saw during COVID tremendous government overreach, where people were taken off the system for not agreeing with what the norm was. For example, I bring up the truckers protesting the vaccine in Canada and how the Trudeau administration cut them off the banking system and anyone that was trying to donate to them. So, of course, that's a lot easier when you have a CBDC, which is programmable. So it creates like a sense of self-censorship. But also, you know, the idea is that this will probably be linked to a climate change, climate concern agenda, and we would monitor your carbon output. And there's developments about that coming from North Korea, which I'll get into in a bit, but it would monitor your carbon output. So, you know, you have taken 10 flights this month, you've exceeded your carbon output, your money doesn't work to buy another plane ticket, or it does, but with a 10% premium.
Yep.
So that, of course, is another big concern here.
Yeah, and I think people need to understand that the word programmable gets a little confusing. The net result is the exact same, but I don't know that the currency would be programmable, because it's just like the current currency, but it's just on a separate balance sheet, right? We talked about it just goes from the commercial bank's balance sheet just over the Fed. But I think they just have an algorithm, to your point, you know, and it would basically be the exact same thing, where this algorithm since they now have all the data coming in for every single transaction in real time, they can just take whatever you've spent today, or just in the last 5 minutes, and crunch that through that algorithm. And that algorithm, that would dictate your social credit score. And then based on your social credit score, that could go into the lending that we talked about earlier, or what that could also do is put a cap on certain usage or ways that you spend your money. And then if you do anything that exceeds that, either you're completely cut off or you have to pay some sort of tax.
Right. Again, a big concern that not many people are even noticing, but 130 countries are in active stages of exploring a CBDC or central bank currency. Now, their counter argument is that, no, this is fantastic because it deters crime, it deters money laundering, and it's also a way to fine-tune monetary policy.
Yeah. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that argument, because I think that's how they're going to pull the wool over our eyes. Because there are some very positive things about a central bank digital currency. It is very efficient. It's going to be very cheap. In fact, I think it'll be free. Where right now, as an example, you might have to pay to transfer your dollars into pesos if you're going on a Mexican vacation. In the future, that'll probably be free. So is that a benefit? Sure.
Initially,
but
sure.
It's all about trade-offs.
Yeah.
That's the secret, or that's the key. It's all about those trade-offs. So what price are you paying for that efficiency? You know, before we went on camera, we were talking about in the future, when they roll this out, it's very unlikely that they're going to say, "Hey guys, we're doing this CBDC thing, the one monetary system that all you gold bugs and people at the New Orleans Investment Conference have been worried about. We're going to go ahead and roll that." Why would they do that? You know, the CBDC itself has a very bad brand, if you want to look at it from a PR standpoint. So they're not going to tell you. They're not going to tell you.
Yeah.
You know, why would they tell you that the liabilities have gone from the commercial banking system over to the Fed? You won't know the difference. And the thought experiment that I always encourage people to do is ask yourself, how do you know you're not using a central bank digital currency right now? Right? With this water, with the coffee, with what we got for lunch, or just some person that's watching this video.
Meaning, how do I know that Citibank, say I paid for this on my credit card, Citibank doesn't carry that liability as opposed to the Fed?
Yeah, exactly. Your debit card can say Citibank or Wells Fargo, but how do you know that those dollars are actually a liability of Citibank? How do you know that they're not a liability of the Federal Reserve? The answer is you don't know. You would have absolutely no way of knowing. So I think they're just going to roll out the features. They're going to gradually move everything over to the Fed's balance sheet. And they're going to roll out these features. I think FedNow is the first step for that. FedNow is not a central bank digital currency, but they're starting to roll out these features that you would have with a CBDC. So you have instant settlement, 24/7. I think the next thing is going to be overseas transfers, because they're going to look at all these remittances and they're going to say, oh my gosh, look at the banking system ripping everyone off. If we could just do it through the central bank, then everything's going to be free, and look at how much money the poor people are going to save. And people aren't going to they're going to sit there and they're going to look at all these benefits coming their way, and they're going to say, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
This is awesome. This is amazing. But what they don't realize is that behind the scenes, they're setting things up for the big brother Orwellian rug pull, right? And another example that I use for people, I would consider myself a libertarian, and I'm someone that advocates for freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. So I am completely opposed to this type of system. And I think a lot of people would fall into that category that probably watch this show or that watch my YouTube channel. But I asked them a very difficult question, a very hard thought experiment. It's, take out your cell phone right now. And if I told you tomorrow that every single thing that you did on your cell phone would not only be tracked by the central government, but it would lead to you having a credit score or a social score, which would impact what you can and you can't buy. Would you stop using your cell phone? Yes or no? If every single person watching this video right now, if they answer honestly, the answer would probably be no.
Because we're too dependent on it.
That's right. So I think that's what they're going to do with the central bank digital currency. They're not going to announce it. They're going to roll out all these features to get you into the network to where you're completely integrated into the system. And then they're going to say, okay, by the way, now all of your dollar liabilities are on the Fed's balance sheet. And oh, by the way, we're rolling out this social credit score. And then all the normies are just going to rationalize it. they're going to say, oh, well, it's not so bad. They're going to rationalize it just like they would using their cell phone.
Right. Once it becomes such a critical, integrated part of your life, it's very hard to give it up. I mean, if before we started using cell phones, someone would say to us, this is going to allow authorities to track your location and to potentially track what you're looking up. I mean, they already have access to all of that data. Some cell phones, have the ability to even listen into conversations depending on your settings, right? So maybe had they said that up front, people would have said no. But where we are right now, no one's giving up a cell phone, knowing how dependent we are on that.
Yep.
So let's bring it. You mentioned the Fed now. That launched in July, and that's largely been seen as laying the railway, the groundworks for a central bank digital currency.
It's some of the benefits. Yeah, it's kind of the back end plumbing.
Right. Why is that? How does that work with regards to actual banks right now?
Because it allows more of the transactions to go straight through the Fed through a centralized system, as opposed to a third party, which it was doing before.
So the Fed now launched in July is one of the reasons that strategists at Wells Fargo are saying that a CBDC, a US CBDC, is 3 to 5 years away. It's just, people need to realize, I hate to be defeatist on this, because I think there are ways for people who value what we value to kind of unplug out of the system as much as possible. But we need to be honest with ourselves. We can't just bury our head in the sand. So we have to realize that this isn't a matter of if, it's simply a matter of when. And unfortunately, most of the people out there are going to welcome a CBDC because they're not going to understand the downsides. They're just going to see these initial benefits that are presented by the central planners. Well, the guys over at Wells Fargo, the strategist at the subsidiary there, in a new report, John Lafarge and Mason Mendez say that it'll be between 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Is that a realistic timeline for you?
I think so. And it all depends on the next crisis. We know one thing for sure, that the central planners and the authoritarians, they'll never let a crisis go to waste. So if you told me, George, we're not going to have another crisis between now and the next 5 years, I would peg that at maybe, we'll call it 50-50 probability. If you tell me that the yield curve is correct, we got an inverted yield curve, so that would imply that we're going to have a hard landing, most likely in 2024, and that could be something that looks like the GFC. If you said that's what we're going to have, then I would up that to 3 years, and I'd up my probability to probably 75%. Because if a lot of these banks start to go bust, we talked about that earlier as well, that's going to be the perfect excuse for the Federal Reserve to come out and say, look, why on earth do we even have the FDIC? This is nonsense. You've got your dollars as a liability of a banking system that can fail. And that creates economic uncertainty, right? That prevents people from going out there and spending. That prevents businesses from hiring. Just look what we dealt with Silicon Valley. And maybe in 2024, if this banking crisis continues, look at what we're dealing with right now. This is going to be the pitch, right? So instead of having to deal with the FDIC, which, by the way, can't insure 20 trillion in deposits, they only have 180 billion in their reserves. So they can't insure that. So why are we going through all of this rigmarole? Why don't we just take those deposit liabilities from the banking system and let's just put them on the one balance sheet that can never, ever, ever go bust? And another way that they'll pitch it to you is, oh, by the way, right now you're probably getting 2% on your checking account with Citi. Why don't you just move that over to the Fed, and then you can get the exact same interest rate that we're paying Jamie Dimon? Because right now we're paying Jamie Dimon, or JP Morgan, interest on reserves, we're paying him 5.25%. But you, the average Joe, you're out there just looking for table scraps at 2%, where if you just moved your dollar assets over the Fed's balance sheet, we could pay the exact same thing, and it makes it more fair for the average Joe and Jane. This is going to be their pitch, and I think most people will say, yeah, why not?
And we'll get into the details of how there could be a potential banking collapse by early 2024, according to some of your recent work. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
But I want to focus a little bit more on this Wells Fargo analysis. And they're saying that CBDCs are programmable, as we've covered, which means they have the potential to be tracked, monitored, and shut down by authorities. And they say potential is the operative word, as the technology is flexible and can be designed to be privacy friendly. So they may disguise it like that. But they do make the point that the debate over a potential US CBDC will continue to increase. And they say expect to hear the term CBDC more regularly with the 2024 election approaching. You know, George, it amazes me that I talk to so many people, and not necessarily the people that I interview on this show, but people that I meet in a private capacity in my social life that perhaps run, big hedge funds that work for some of the largest asset managers in the world. And I say, are you concerned about a CBDC? And they say, a what? And I go, a central bank digital currency. And they have no idea what I'm even talking about, even though this is starting to become a political issue. So I want to focus a little bit about that. Because we are starting to see some awareness about that. Arguably, that's a very good thing. If it becomes a political issue, we get to hear about it more. So we have the Republican and Democratic divide over this. It seems to be an issue that is divided across those party lines. We have the Chief Majority Whip, Tom Emmer. He put forward a CBDC Anti-Surveillance State Act. The House Financial Services Committee panel on digital assets allowed that to go to the House floor for a vote. It hasn't been voted on yet. But in that bill, and he's trying to pass other bills, highlighting CBDCs, in that it basically says that the CBDC can only be issued pursuant to congressional authorization. So it prevents the Fed from issuing a CBDC directly or indirectly to individuals, or maintaining accounts on behalf of individuals.
Yeah, but that's already on the books. That's part of the Federal Reserve Act, where they're not allowed to have accounts.
Right, so my point is, that does it make us feel any better that it would have to have congressional approval?
No. I think it is good that people are talking about it. And I'm glad the Republicans are showing some of the downsides. My concern is that the Republicans really don't understand how it works. So the central planners that are really kind of pulling the strings here will be able to implement it without those Republicans even knowing it. Like that, or whatever politician you just talked about. If you went to that guy and said, okay, I know you're very anti-CBDC, but if we have this, let's assume we're in a banking crisis, would you be opposed to the dollar assets of Wells Fargo if they're going bust, just moving over to the Fed? He'd probably say, no problem. Because he doesn't even understand the back-end plumbing. So how is he going to prevent something that he doesn't even understand if the central planners don't announce it, which they won't?
So no consolation that they may bring it to a vote for Congress if, as you say, it's framed in a way that it's a savior to a potential crisis or to a looming crisis.
Yeah, because we could be using a CBDC right now. The same thing, the same politician could be using a CBDC just to buy his morning Starbucks, and he wouldn't even know the difference. So that doesn't give, I am glad that people are talking about it, but all this does is gives it more and more and more negative PR as far as the term, which just incentivizes the central planners to not tell us that they're doing it, or give it some sort of other label that people are far more receptive to, even these Republican politicians. It reminds me also, if you want to know how fast this is really progressing, people need to go back and look at some of my YouTube videos I was doing in 2019, where I was talking about a central bank digital currency. And I can tell you, if you read some of those comments, you'll see that people are calling me an absolute tinfoil hatter. They're saying, oh, George, I used to like your videos, but now I don't because you've just gone too extreme. You're just like Alex Jones, and you're just trying to fear monger and use clickbait just to get views, and you're just crazy. I'm unsubscribed. They'll sit there and tell you in the comments. Yeah. And that's the type of response that I would get when I talked about CBDCs in 2019, not in 2009, in 2019. And then what you see in 2020 is gradually more people start talking about it. Then you see in 2021, now all of a sudden you got Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell talking about it. Now it's just all over the mainstream news. So that's how fast this is actually progressing. And that's another reason why I think it's just a matter of when, it's not a matter of if. You've also got to ask yourself, what's the downside for the central planners? Why wouldn't they do this? Like you'd be crazy not to want to implement this. And if the global governments can unify all these insane, I would call them tyrants, that can unify around the lockdowns and locking everyone in a cage, for heaven's sakes, why couldn't they also come together on this central bank digital currency, which inevitably would give them even more control.
And yes, it's a good thing that some politicians have been vocal about it, like Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida said that he would ban CBDCs in Florida.
You can't ban
Right.
That just shows he doesn't know what he's talking about, because you can't ban a CBDC in one state or the other. So it's up to us, like it's up to Kitco News, for heaven's sakes, to get the word out there, so these politicians that are philosophically opposed to it, to get them up to speed to where they understand it enough to actually make a difference.
So Michael Saylor, who I've chatted to about this, says that he doesn't think a CBDC will be implemented because it'll be so politically divisive and no politician is going to want to back it. But you're saying they're going to sneak it in so people don't even necessarily come out and say, I'm for this. That there would be like lack of knowledge about who's really for this, who's really behind this.
Yeah, that.
So there's no consolation there. So the fact that some politicians are opposed to it and vocally opposed to it, and the hope that their constituents will support them or support the group that's opposed to it, is of no consolation, because it will be disguised in the way it enters the.
So, on one hand, I think it's a good thing that people are talking about it. On the other hand, I think it could be a bad thing that they're talking about it without understanding it. Because what this does is this, I hate to use misinformation, but let's say it miseducates the general public that we need on our side to be really, really aware of what's going on with the plumbing. So it's almost like you're creating a diversionary tactic. Like you're saying, hey, look over here, general public, CBDC bad, CBDC bad, CBDC bad. All this does is it makes it easier for the central planners to go through the back door, because everyone thinks that a CBDC is an alternative currency, like a Fed coin, when in reality, that's all it is it's just moving the dollar deposit liabilities from the commercial banking system onto the Fed. It's just all about unifying the balance sheets. It's not about a Fed coin versus a dollar.
Right. It's not like we're going to launch something called Fed coin. It's
if everyone's looking over here for Fed coin, it allows them to sneak in an actual CBDC and then just talk about the benefits. And next thing you know, you wake up with a social score and no one knows how it happened.
So the benefits could be, giving valuable insights into the economy, into the global economy. This is according to Wells Fargo. With the US dollar as the world reserve currency, it helps maintain that status, better monetary intelligence for central planners. They say those pros must be weighed against the potential loss of privacy, as we've discussed, and everything that can go wrong there. Again, this is the Wells Fargo report that's looking at the pros and cons here. But in terms of one of the points of maintaining the dollar as a global reserve currency and supremacy on that front, some of the Democrats that have been pushing back against the CBDC idea as presented right now are saying that we have to do it because it keeps the U.S. Ahead of the game. So, for example, Maxine Waters, who's also on the House Financial Services Committee, she says it'll keep the U.S. Behind other countries, including China, if we don't do it, saying we need it to stay competitive. Another Democrat, Representative Stephen Lynch, he says it's needed because countries like Russia and China are moving forward with their own CBDC projects. Can that case have merit? Can there be a scenario where all of these other countries move aggressively with a digital form of their currency? And we know that this was pioneered by the People's Bank of China, right? The PBOC was the first to launch this. Right. And they've already linked it to a social credit system, which, is the first red flag. But is there validity to the case that the U.S. can't be left behind if everybody else comes on board?
If I had to make an argument for that, I could. But in reality, I think it's nonsense. That just shows a misunderstanding of the global monetary system as it is right now. And you talk about a digital currency. Well, that's really all the dollar is. You got to look at the dollar as two completely separate currencies. You got a domestic dollar, and then you actually have the global reserve currency, which is the dollar outside the United States, and that would be in the euro dollar system. Yeah. And that is created by a network of banks that operate pretty much in the shadows. So that's already basically a digital currency. It's not a central bank digital currency, but it's a digital currency that's the global reserve currency of this cartel of banks that operate in shadows outside of the United States. So what those politicians are talking about is the dollar being replaced and all these other things by this other network, a central bank digital currency, and how people are just going to adopt that. If the United States doesn't do it, then all of a sudden people are going to gravitate to using the digital yuan or the digital ruble instead of the dollar. And that's complete nonsense. But if I had to argue their point, what I would say is that would allow the central banks of those other countries to issue credit with basically a 0% interest rate. Because of what we said earlier, that the central bank, to a certain degree, as long as they have confidence, and that's key, but as long as they have confidence, they have an infinite balance sheet. So the Bank of China, as an example, with their Belt and Road Initiative, they could come out and issue all these yuan for this infrastructure at a 0% interest rate. So if that entity on the ground that's going to pave those roads, let's say, they've got two options. They can borrow yuan at 0% interest rates, or they can borrow the dollar because it's not coming from the government, it's coming from the Eurodollar system that has to make a profit. Then they can borrow that at 5% interest rates. So what are you going to do? Well, if you're that road paver, well, shoot, you're going to go with the 0% interest rate digital yuan if you don't think there's much FX risk, or you can hedge that out. So if I had to argue their side of it, that's how I'd argue it, that it allows those other central banks to compete against the dollar by issuing cheaper credit.
Well, what about the idea of changing the overall operating system, right? Because the ECB is looking at this, as we've discussed, 130 countries, and they're also working at interoperability between various central banks.
That's unifying the ledger.
Right. So
they're trying to get creative.
If you don't have that version, right? Can the US be left out of that system? Can it afford to be left out of that system? Is there a way to?
I think it can afford to. Absolutely.
I mean, does it damage? Look, from a personal.
Are you looking at this from a standpoint of the central planners or the average Joes?
No, from the average Joes. I mean, I make no qualms about it. I'm clearly very opposed to a CBDC because I think once that is out of the box, there's no putting it back in, right? And sure, you can say it'll be used for purposes that are positive, but there's no taking it back. And then, it's a potentially, as we said, dystopian Orwellian future. But from an American perspective of maintaining dollar supremacy, maintaining the role of the US in the global economy, if all of these countries are shifting to a central bank digital currency operating system, and can the US stay out of it?
Yeah, ironically enough, I think it would actually benefit them. If you're them, meaning whoever's view was that they want the dollar to remain supreme. They want the dollar to remain the most widely used settlement currency in the globe. And the reason I say that is because, look, what we're doing is we got two competing systems. One system is done by the free market. That would be the Eurodollar system. Okay. And then the other system is going to be centrally planned. So who wins that race? Who wins that competition? My money is going to be on the free market system, not the centrally planned system. Because what you're talking about with a central bank digital currency, by definition, is something where credit or the use of that system is centrally planned. And we know that's going to be very, very, very inefficient at the end of the day. Where the dollar system that we have right now, see, most people think that the dollar system is micromanaged by the Federal Reserve and the US government. They need to get that out of their head. Although domestically it might be. The real dollar system outside of the United States is managed by that global cartel of banks that operate in the shadows, that network of banks. And that's completely free market. There's no cash in that. There's no bank reserves. That is like the ultimate free market experiment in currency, right? So you've got that system competing against those other central banks. And again, I'm going to put my money on the system that not only has huge network effects because it's been in existence since the 1950s, but also has the ability to navigate and make far better decisions and is going to be far more efficient than something that is some sort of concoction of a politician.
Well, I mean, I guess the question is, does the network effect get lost if and I'm not talking about tomorrow, but if the rest of the world, moves to the system?
But your point there, you got to remember who's the rest of the world. So what most people talk about when they talk about the rest of the world moving to the system is the politicians. But that's not the people boots on the ground. See, the people that really matter are the people who are the businesses, the enterprises, the entities that are in the real economy in Saudi Arabia, in Russia, in China, as an example. And you can have a politician come out here and say, oh, we want you to start using the digital ruble. Well, okay, screw you. I don't want your stupid digital ruble.
Right, but as we've just discussed, they sneak it in. You know, you're in...
No, but what they say right now is, I don't want your stupid digital ruble. I want the dollar. You know, we were talking about this before we went live as well. And that's the fact that although if you're an American, absolutely, you've gotten screwed by holding dollars since, let's say, 2009, well, for a long, long time, but especially since 2019, because the consumer price index went up north of 9%. And that's as the government admits to. Really, the inflation rate was much, much higher. So your dollars are crashing against goods and services. But you have to understand that for everyone else out, not everyone, but for a large majority of the global population, their dollars actually appreciated in value against local goods and services. Because I live in Colombia, Medellin, Colombia. And right now, although we have had local inflation, the value of the dollar has appreciated against the local currency much more than the inflation rate. So my dollars buy more goods and services than it did back in 2019, even though the dollar has lost value relative to goods and services in the United States. So people need to understand that when they're looking at these supply-demand dynamics outside the United States, it's you've got to do that through the lens of someone whose expenses are denominated in a completely different currency. And when you do that, you can see the incentive that is set up for all of these average Joe and Janes, all these businesses, the road paver that we talked about in Africa that's on the Belt and Road system. You see the incentive for them to actually hold dollars, as much as that pisses most of the gold bugs off that are here at this conference.
Well, and because of the fact that the dollar has purchasing power, dramatic purchasing power in other countries, that has been one of the reasons that's brought a lot of anger and frustration from the developing world, and this trend of de-dollarization, which maybe fits into this narrative as well when we move into a central bank digital currency. And
I hate to cut you off there, but my main point is, look, we are absolutely de-dollarizing. The world is de-dollar. There is no doubt about that, and it's going to continue. But that doesn't mean that the dollar implodes tomorrow, and it doesn't mean that the dollar crashes. It's just like we started transitioning from the British pound over to dollars in the 1920s, way before Bretton Woods. But we never did that as a result of top down. There was never a king or a president that came out and said, we're going to crown the dollar, the new reserve currency, and all you plebs out there are going to start using the dollar. No, it always happens bottom up. The people want to start doing business with the United States because they're a great customer, and they're transacting, and that incentivizes them to hold more and more dollars. It's going back to the 1920s as an example. So in the future, will the dollar lose the reserve status? Absolutely, but it'll be a result of what's happening from the bottom up, not the top down.
Well, I have to segue quickly and say how far out in the future then?
I mean, if I had to peg it, I'd say 20, 25 years, but then you have to define what it means for the dollar to lose reserve status. Does that mean that the majority of the transactions that are settled globally, global GDP, are now done in another currency? Does that mean that the dollar goes below 50%? Does that mean that just fewer central banks are holding it as a reserve currency? You've got to define it. Really, the way I would define it is what percentage of overall GDP is being settled in dollars or XYZ currency. And if the dollar goes down, let's say right now it's 70%. Let's say the dollar goes down to 40% and some other currency went up to above 40, then I would say that yes, now we can say definitively that the dollar has lost reserve status. But ironically, that might even increase the value of the dollar relative to other currencies. It's very counterintuitive there.
How would it increase the value of the dollar?
Because what you have is if the dollar was no longer the reserve currency, demand would go down. So if that demand goes down, then more of the dollar-denominated debt would be paid off. So as an example, let's say you have a dollar-denominated mortgage right now for whatever, $500,000. Okay, that's what you owe on it. And let's say you had all these dollars flooding in, but you didn't want any of them because you wanted to use this BRICS currency that was backed by gold. You don't trust the dollar anymore, but you had all these dollars flooding in. So what are you going to do? Well, you're not going to sell all of them because you've got this dollar-denominated debt that you still have to deal with. You have that contract with the bank. So you're going to take all those dollars that you're receiving that you don't want, and you're going to pay off your debt. Well, what does that do to the amount of dollars? That decreases it.
Provided that the US doesn't print more dollars or issue more debt.
Well, see, this is a very good point, because now you're getting into the nitty-gritty, which means that you've got to compartmentalize and put the dollars that are being created into certain buckets. And then you have to do an analysis on what percentage of dollars that exist fall into the bucket of what I call demand dollars and then supply dollars. So what you're talking about right there, which is very insightful, by the way, is that if the dollars, let's say, were just created green pieces of paper by the government, like 1862 in the Legal Tender Act, then you're right, and those dollars would not disappear once that loan was paid off. But see, right now, because the dollar is the global reserve currency, the majority of dollars out there are lent into existence. So therefore, if the demand crashes, then the amount of dollars will crash because that dollar-denominated debt is actually paid off. Now, to your point, in that scenario, the government could come out and literally print green pieces of paper. But you have to understand.
Or sell more US debt, right? Dollar-denominated
No, because then you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. So it depends on who you're selling the debt to. Assuming that you're selling the debt to a non-bank entity, you're just pulling cash over here and spending it over there. But the amount of cash in the system, or M2 money supply, doesn't really change, you see. So, but the point there is, if the government is in a position to where they're printing, what most likely is going to happen in that environment is the banking system, because of uncertainty, is going to be creating fewer and fewer loans. So you see the banking system on net balance has a lot fewer dollars, and all the United States government doing is filling that gap.
So the equilibrium balance is out there.
Yeah, that's the way it could play out. Now, we could go into this crazy, crazy world where the government is literally printing like $10 trillion of green pieces of paper every single year. And yes, that would create a dollar crash, but the probability of that occurring, I think, is very low. I think your risk with the dollar is not that it crashes down. Your risk with the dollar is that it crashes up.
Expand on that. Even though we've sidetracked a bit from CBDCs, but expand on that.
Yeah, so I think that right now, if we're going to use the dollar strength or weakness, we'll use the DXY as a proxy for that. Right now, it's trading about 106, which would mean the dollar is historically pretty strong. So most people are worried about the dollar just hyperinflating and, on the DXY just dropping down to zero, Weimar Germany, Venezuela type of thing. Where what they are, it was not on their bingo card, is the DXY not going down to 10, but the DXY going to 200. And I think there's a much higher probability that the DXY, maybe not to 200, but there's a much higher probability that the DXY goes to 130, 140, 150 than the dollar going down to, let's say, 60 or 50 on the DXY.
And that probability would be because there would be a flight to safety of a dollar. What would trigger that?
That you're close. So it would be
geopolitical tensions that create a flight to safety type of scenario?
Yes, and if we have a global recession, which most people are predicting right now, what that means is the banks are going to be risk off. And all the banks that create the global reserve currency, which is really the euro dollar, all these banks will stop lending. It's just like what we've seen here around Silicon Valley Bank, where the issuance of credit has really gone down because the banks, they're looking around and they're saying, my goodness gracious, we don't want to take any risk right now because we might not be paid back. So what you have is the dollar liquidity. The real providers of dollar liquidity, the banking system, not the Federal Reserve, the banking system, they're really pulling back. That reduces dollar liquidity, but you still have the exact same amount of dollar-denominated debt. You see, so then what happens is all these entities, they can no longer pay that dollar-denominated debt because they don't have the dollar cash flow. Because the global economy is slowing down, they can't borrow it because the dollar liquidity is tightening up from these banks. So what they have to do is they have to take the local currency asset that's on their balance sheet and sell that in order to buy the dollars, to pay off the dollar debt, or to buy the things that they need that are denominated in dollars, such as oil, such as commodities. So what that does is that creates more of the supply of the local currency, and more the demand for the dollar, which makes the dollar go higher and higher and higher.
So that actually brings up a very interesting point, and that is commodities denominated in dollars. And
that's a double whammy.
And the petrodollar, though arguably what's really, for most parts, maintaining the dollar strength. And on that note, I mean, we're starting to see transactions being done for oil not using the dollar. And very recently, we had the first use of the Chinese digital yuan being used to settle a cross-border oil deal. Yeah. So they're not only using yuan, but they're using the e-yuan, their digital yuan, for a cross-border oil deal. It wasn't disclosed who the seller was and what the exact price was, but we do know that the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange reported that PetroChina International successfully purchased 1 million barrels of crude oil using the digital yuan on October 19th. So, I mean, there are a couple of points to get from that tidbit of news, and one is a lot of what's keeping the dollar together is the fact that oil is denominated in dollars and commodities are denominated in dollars, and the petrodollar, right?
No. Let me rephrase that. What's keeping the demand for dollar high, part of that is due to the petrodollar, but that doesn't mean the value of the dollar high. You see, because it goes back to our last example there. I completely agree that the world is de-dollarizing. There is absolutely no doubt about that. In the future, just gradually, slowly, as these other economies get bigger and bigger and bigger as far as the percentage of global GDP, the dollar will go down as far as the percentage of transactions that are settled in dollars. But we have to remember that if the dollar is lent into existence, if the majority of the dollars are outside the United States, the lower the demand, the lower the supply. You see, so yes, demand will be going down, but that's not going to impact the equilibrium of the demand of dollars relative to the existing supply. And that's what people really need to get their head around.
What about the concept of the digital yuan being used more and more for international trade, and linking back to this idea of, can the U.S. not play this game with, and be left out of that if we're seeing more trade being settled using central bank digital currencies and whatever system of interoperability that they'll be developing? And there have been a number. Project Icebreaker, I know, has been looking at several currencies working together. Can the U.S. not participate if we're seeing trade being settled, as we've just seen, using central bank digital currencies? Yeah, because in my opinion, we're not participating right now. I mean, we're not doing the dirty work here. And what I mean by us is the U.S. government or the Federal Reserve. Because that idea implies that the Federal Reserve or the central planners in the United States are at the middle of the dollar monetary solar system. And they're not. It's the banks. So it's not the U.S. against Russia and China. It's the global network of banks against China and against Russia. And I don't think China and Russia can really compete with that unless, which I think this is going to happen, and we see it happening right now, all the entities, forget the politicians and the central banks, but all the road pavers in the Belt and Road Initiative, let's say, and I'm just using them as a proxy for all the real businesses that are on the ground that have to have payroll, that have input costs, that have to buy all these things, right? Once they start transitioning, not because of some sort of authority that's just made this mandate from above, no, because they actually want to. And that's the process that we're seeing play out right now, but that takes a lot of time. And as that takes, as we see that manifest, as we see that evolve, then yes, the dollar will be used to a much less degree. But I don't think it's going to happen just as a result of China or Russia setting up a CBDC and doing a few oil transactions between countries. That doesn't really involve the people that are boots on the ground, and those are the individuals that matter. And you don't think that accelerates the de-dollarization trend? It might accelerate it, but again, I don't think that accelerates the decline of the dollar as far as the value of the dollar relative to other foreign currencies. Now, to your point, it could devalue the dollar domestically relative to goods and services, but just because let's go through that example. So let's say that all or a lot of these entities that were using dollars no longer are, and therefore those dollars come flooding back into the United States. Now, ironically enough, that would create, most likely,
quite a bit of consumer price inflation because you have more currency units in the United States chasing goods and services. But what's weird is you'd have the exact same amount of dollar-denominated debt outside the United States, but you'd have fewer dollars to service it. So what would happen is you could see inflation in the United States going to 10, 15, 20%, while at the same time, the dollar on the DXY is going to 110, 120, 130 to a point where the United States government has to come in and actually intervene to bring down the dollar in the international markets, while at the same time, inflation is running at 10 or 15% in the United States.
That would be quite a messy conundrum, but not entirely, but on the bingo card.
Yeah.
But it is potentially.
That's actually my base case, is that the dollar continues to go higher. You know, it never goes up in a straight line, but it continues to go higher until they do like a Plaza Accord 2.0, while at the same time, we see higher than normal consumer price inflation, called the 1970s, in the United States. That's my base case.
That's your base case. Yep. And then they have
over the 2020s.
So the dollar loses purchasing power within the U.S., gets more purchasing power outside of the U.S., forcing the Fed to intervene because it becomes problematic for exports, I would think.
Oh, it becomes problematic for the entire global economy. And the United States...
And that's the base case.
Yeah, and the United States is completely dependent upon the global economy. So we can't just sit there and let the dollar crush every single one of our trading partners, no matter how much we don't like Russia, no matter how much we don't like China or XYZ countries, Saudi Arabia. We can't allow them to completely fail, or we will fail. That's just the bottom line. So if the dollar is creating this wrecking ball type of scenario, which it would if it goes up to 120, 130, the United States is not going to have a choice but to come in and intervene to bring the value of the dollar down, which exacerbates the inflation problem here in the United States. Because let's remember for a moment that going back to 2022, the dollar went from about 90 on the DXY up to 106 where it is today. Okay, but during that, think about that, but during that time, we had inflation year over year in the United States go up over 9%, where most of the stuff that we buy at Walmart, Target, Home Depot is all being imported from places like China. So we had 9% inflation while the dollar was going up. Think about what the inflation rate would have been if the dollar was going down. So if the central planners are intervening and intentionally, artificially bringing the dollar down in price, while at the same time we have 10 or 15% consumer price inflation, that just takes inflation up to the next level. And that's what I think, nobody's really thinking about that. Nobody's talking about it. And I think that that's a big, big mistake.
So purchasing power of the dollar, as you quite rightly pointed out, domestically has deteriorated drastically, but the dollar strengthened in global markets. The Dixie has been doing very well. So when you say intervention, what would that look like?
Plaza Accord 2.0. I think what they would do, I've tried to think about the mechanics of how that would work.
You're going to have to explain the Plaza Accord 2.0.
Okay, so the Plaza Accord going back to 1985, I believe, is the dollar got up to right around 150 on the DXY. And it did a lot of things that were detrimental to the United States and the global economy. So they met with a bunch of countries, but it was mostly Japan and Germany. And they said, listen, we need to bring down the value of the dollar. We need to make the yen, and at the time, I guess the Deutschmark, appreciate in value. And they all agreed that that's what they were going to do. So they started selling their dollar reserves to bring down the overall level of the dollar. And that's what we saw the Plaza Accord. And by the way, the dollar went down by about 50%, if my memory serves me well. So I think that, if the dollar today got to 120, 130, I think that would put the global economy in that same predicament that they were in back in the mid-1980s, where they'd have to intervene. And if they intervene by bringing the dollar down another 50%, while at the same time inflation is running high, that goes back to that scenario we were talking about. We're kind of adding fuel to the fire.
Okay, so just to bring it back, you're saying the U.S. does not have to have a digital dollar in order to compete on the world stage, but that doesn't mean that they won't go ahead and do it anyway. That's not a compelling reason to do it, but that it's still likely that the U.S. is still going to do it.
Yeah, because if you're a central planner, why would you not?
Right. You're saying that is not a reason to do it, but that doesn't mean that that's what's going to stop them from doing it. And to that point, want to bring up some of other global developments, because other countries moving very aggressively with this. Just today, Swiss National Bank said that it's going to start a pilot project next month using central bank digital currencies, the Swiss franc wholesale version for financial institutions with UBS and 5 other banks in Switzerland.
Which, by the way, let's think about that. So Switzerland. Who's in Switzerland?
Well, what do you mean who's in Switzerland?
Klaus.
Well, Klaus, World Economic Forum.
That's right. So they're right there in Davos. So is it any surprise that the leader that's on the cutting edge of central bank digital currencies is the Swiss national government? I mean, you could call that a coincidence. I don't know. I would put on the tinfoil hat for that one. And I would say that Klaus is kind of behind the scenes with the Swiss central bank and saying, okay, guys, let's push this. Because at the end of the day, and I use Klaus just as a proxy for the global elite, the Davos types. I think the global elite want this global central bank digital currency. And regardless of who the president was in the United States, they would push that through whatever mechanism they have. Because one of the big issues that I think they've explicitly said is these wild card type of elections that we have here in the United States. We got Donald Trump, and you can like Donald Trump, you can hate Donald Trump, but the one thing we know for sure is the global elite definitely hate Donald Trump. They do not want someone like that in power, and I think they see the United States as the one place in the world that it's difficult for them to control. So if they had a workaround through the presidential process, let's say, so if we did elect someone that they didn't like, it really wouldn't matter because they'd have control via the monetary system, then being plugged into that CBDC system that we're talking about, that unified ledger with the BIS that the Swiss National Bank is on the forefront of. Right. If the United States was plugged into that, then they would sit there and say, well, who cares who the president of the United States is? Now we can just let that, to the whims of the U.S. democratic system because we control the monetary system, and we've taken that away from those banks in the Eurodollar system, and I think that's their end game.
Okay, so for the normies, as you like to call them, out there that may not be familiar with this broader agenda, the Great Reset, One World Currency agenda, just a very quick explanation of what that is, because that's sort of what's the linchpin of what you're saying is right now.
Well, it's control. It's control. And if you look at the global elite, the people that we were talking about, I would throw the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the UN, the EU, etc., the World Bank, BIS, they're all in that category. These people are, I refer to them as the Malthusian Marxist cult. And that may sound sensational to people, but if you actually read and listen to what they say, that's just a descriptive term. That's not being hyperbolic at all. They are a cult, and their number one prophet, if you will, is Thomas Malthus. That's where you get the word Malthusianism. So a Malthusian view is a view that there's just too many people on the planet Earth relative to the amount of resources that we have. So Thomas Malthus always looked at things like war, disease, famine. He actually looked at them through a positive lens. Like, oh yeah, we got this war or we got this Black Plague thing, but hey, it's actually pretty good because now we reduced the amount of people on the planet relative to the supply of resources. So yeah, I mean, I don't like the fact that half the planet died, but well, at the end of the day, it is a good thing, right? So that was his main view. And if you look at all of the writings, not all, but the majority of the writings from groups like the World Economic Forum, they have this view kind of built in to every single thing that they do, every single thing that they write, every single Davos meeting that they have. So whenever you see this climate change agenda, it's not about climate change. You've got to forget about that because people get too divided as to whether it's real, whether it's not, whether it's a problem, whether it is. Forget about that. The one thing that we do know is that the global elite don't care about climate change. They just care about fewer people on the planet Earth. So when you look at things through that lens, you understand, okay, well, how would they determine, how would they dictate, how would they control not only the amount of people on Earth, but what you spend money on. Because at the end of the day, it's that you are using too many resources, and they need to micromanage that.
Right.
So the easiest way to do that would be through a central bank digital currencies. But it goes back to their worldview. Once you understand that their worldview is Marxist, the central planning, and Malthusian, there's too many people on this planet relative to resources, everything that's going on right now makes sense.
And to that end, George, when you're talking about controlling supply, controlling consumption, obviously a central bank digital currency lets you do that, but that is enhanced when you start to tokenize assets, right?
Oh, yeah.
And what we heard from the Swiss National Bank, they're saying that tokenized assets are already being used in some areas of the financial system. They promise to deliver efficiency gains and greater transparency. So explain the idea of how tokenized assets on a ledger, on an open blockchain, whatever it may be, and how everything will become tokenized, how everything will have a digital representation of ownership, links back into this whole idea that you just laid out.
Well, the good news, I don't know that everything will be.
Okay, all right.
At the end of the day, I think, there is a above zero probability that gold will not be, that Bitcoin will not be. And, I sit here and at a gold conference and I talk about the dollar not crashing and all these things, but that doesn't mean that I'm not a huge fan of gold or a huge fan of Bitcoin. It's not just, but I'm a huge fan of it, not because I think the dollar is going to crash or go into hyperinflation, but I think even more importantly, it's to have purchasing power outside of this insane system that we're referring to. But getting back to your question, let's give people an example that I think everyone can relate to. Let's say that you own a house right now and you are selling me that house. So right now we could do that in cash, because let's say your house was at $500,000 and I could literally give you a suitcase full of cash. You count it, you say, okay, it's $500,000. We're good to go. I'm gonna go ahead and transfer the title over to George Gammon. Wham, bam, we're done, right? But if that is tokenized, what that means is that house exists in the physical world, but it also exists in the digital world on this balance sheet, on this ledger system that we talk about that's been unified. And that's why I always go back to the core of this whole idea is that you get things onto one ledger, or at the end of the day, a balance sheet. So not only would all the dollars be on the Fed's ledger system, but all of the assets would be on there as well, including your house. So your house exists in the real world, but it also exists as a token, an NFT or something, whatever you want to call it, on their system. Yeah. Okay. So what happens, in order for you to transfer the title to me, that would mean that token would go from your name over to my name. That's basically the title process that we have right now. But if that happens through their system, then you can't just do that without some monetary exchange.
Right, so you can't opt out of the system because there's no representation of it happening.
Exactly.
In the system.
So going back to that, so if I gave you that suitcase of cash, if I gave you that suitcase of cash, well, you could not transfer that token over to me. The only way you could transfer that token over to me is if I transferred you $500,000 worth of CBDC. See, or else it didn't happen, even if it happened in the physical world. Now, there's ways around that, but I think that's kind of getting into the nitty gritty. I think that's the overall concept for people to understand this tokenization process that the BIS talks about and all the central planners talk about in these white papers.
Right, and as you say, they start to drip it in, sneak it in. Oh, this is great. This is super efficient. I have a tokenized version of something. It makes it easier for me, until it becomes the only way that you're allowed to do things.
Yeah, so, and I think they're going to make almost everything free, which is going to be another big selling point. Yeah, so right now, let's say you and I would have to pay, or you would have to pay a 2% fee to the title company or something like that. Where if we're doing it on the Fed's balance sheet, or whatever the heck they call this, right? We're doing it through their tokenized system, then all of a sudden it's free, and they can pay for it. Why? Because the Fed has an infinite balance sheet. They don't have to worry about profit and loss.
And there could be smart contracts that don't even need to use a lawyer, saving even more money that way.
That's right. And that's what they've talked about in their white papers.
Right. Clearly some scary stuff that we need to be aware of. But before we get into the banking system, which a potential crash there, which could be a way this brings us all forward and makes it happen. We are at a gold conference. We are at a resource conference. Why is gold a potential way to protect against this? Why is gold important? What can investors that are watching this, that do see the writing on the wall, what can they do?
Yeah, so you have to realize that almost everyone will have to have a CBDC bank account. There's just, right now it's not realistic for the average Joe and Jane to completely transact outside of the system, especially if they're in the United States, using gold, silver, or Bitcoin. I mean, all the people watching right now, you can imagine trying to pay your rent or your health insurance, your kids' college tuition in Bitcoin or gold. You might be able to find some, like some random college that would do that, but it's not going to be realistic for most people. Now, it doesn't mean that we won't get there in the future. I think we will build ecosystems outside of the current system, which I am very excited about. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about Bitcoin, and you might be able to do that with gold and silver. But bottom line, it's not realistic now unless people want to dramatically reduce their standard of living and basically live in an Amish community. So you have to realize that I'm going to have a bank account in this CBD system. And if I want to get paid, or even what we do on YouTube, to get AdSense dollars from Google, well, they're not going to send you gold coins, for heaven's sakes. They're not going to give you Bitcoin. So you would have to have that bank account, on the Fed's balance sheet. So that's inevitable. So the question becomes, how do you maintain as much privacy as possible, or how do you continue to buy the things that you want to buy, assuming that you exceed that limit that we talked about through that ESG score, right? Let's say you bought too much diesel or too much beef or whatever it is. So I think what you do is you have your paycheck go into the CBDC account, and then from there, you pay all your bills that you can. Whatever you have left over, you extract that and do your best to buy something out of the system, like gold, silver, Bitcoin. And that's what you save in, right? And then when you have to spend some of that savings, or if you have to spend some of those monetary assets that are outside of the system because you've exceeded your score or your monthly allotment that the government knows about through that CBDC account, then you could take your gold, trade it into, or transfer it into dollars, into currency, or Bitcoin, same thing, and then you can go ahead and take that cash and buy gas or diesel or whatever, assuming that they don't take Bitcoin, gold, or silver in the first place. So then the next question becomes, well, what about banning cash?
Yeah.
And that's where a plan B really comes into play. And I think that right now, as an example, I'm in Colombia, about 70% of the transactions are settled there in cash. And people look at this from a US-centric standpoint, or like a developed world where, no one even takes cash. Well, okay, try going to Colombia and no one takes card, right? So that's not to say that they will never have a CBDC. I think that they will, but it gives you much more runway, and it buys you far more time for all these super smart people that are working in the gold space and the Bitcoin space to come up with this alternative system, this other ecosystem where we can transact and buy the majority of our stuff, called a black market, without using that central bank digital currency bank account.
And obviously then it would mean that gold and silver and Bitcoin appreciate dramatically because it's the alternative system, I would think.
It might. It depends.
Does not mean that, no?
I
mean, if there's more demand for gold and there's more demand for Bitcoin and more demand for silver because people want a way to somewhat opt out of the system or to transact away from the system before having to go back in to do those daily transactions. I mean, that sounds to me like more demand for gold, silver, and Bitcoin.
I think it depends on how draconian the central planners are. So when they roll this out, I don't think the first thing that they're going to do is a social credit score.
Right.
They're not going to do that. They're going to give you the rug pull once they got you addicted to the system through all those benefits that we talked about, just like the cell phone.
Yeah.
But when they roll out the social, it depends. I mean, are they saying that if you buy too much diesel, they're just going to incorporate some sort of tax, or are they giving you 10 years in prison? You see, those are two different things.
Yeah.
And I think that if they go the path, and I don't have an answer here, I don't even have a base case, so I would leave that up to you and your viewers to come to their own conclusions. But if they go that 10-year in prison route, yeah, you're going to see a lot of demand for transacting outside of the system. But then it depends on those laws and those penalties as well. If you're caught transacting outside of the system, is that a $100 ticket or is that life in prison? I don't know. So I think these are the things that people really, really need to think through when they're trying to determine how much demand there will be for those monetary units that are outside of the system.
So a black market essentially is what could develop.
Yeah, I think that it absolutely will develop. If you look at history, that's what almost always develops. It's just how the central planners view that, what's the penalty, and if the penalty is too extreme, or if the way that they're controlling the population doesn't seem as draconian to the normies, then they have no incentive to go onto that other system. So you're looking at the world through your lens and through my lens, people who value freedom and liberty and privacy.
Right.
But we have to understand that the majority of the American population is not like you. They're not like me. They're the people that were actually cheering for the lockdowns. They were the people that were begging for the government to lock them down harder. Right? That's a large portion of the American public and the global population. So I think that most of them will gravitate very, very quickly and enthusiastically toward a central bank digital currency, and taking them away from that will be very, very problematic. And I think it'll just be a very small minority of people that will want to transact outside of the system. But the good news is there's a lot of super smart people that fall into that category. So I think that we will have the ability to do that, but it'll take some logistics. It'll take some logistical planning.
But that is still the only way to hedge, to protect against this. What you said is a matter of when, not if.
Yeah. So that's why I'm very vocal about people thinking about this now and trying to have some sort of purchasing power outside of the system. It's why people think that I'm a Bitcoin bear and all that stuff. That's complete nonsense. It's just, I don't care if Bitcoin goes to 1 million or 10,000. For me, that's not the reason to own it. Same thing with gold. Gold could go to 10,000, it could go to 1,000. I really don't care. That doesn't change how important I think it is to actually own gold or Bitcoin or silver.